This is a story about a story. How one of the most famous and influential writers of all time tried to distance himself from his own book for good reason. A fictional story about a school shooting that evidently inspired real-world murders. What to do when life imitates art and ends in tragedy. Quick history lesson on what we're actually dealing with here. Stephen King's career got off to a flying start with Carrie, Salem's Lot and The Shining, establishing him as a very bankable author. The publisher knew that his books would sell, but they also thought that the public wouldn't react well to oversaturation, so they restricted him to just one book per year. Now, we all know that Stephen King writes at a much faster pace than that, so a cunning plan was concocted and the pseudonym Richard Bachman was created. Between 1977 and 1984, Richard Bachman released 5 novels, including The Long Walk and The Running Man, until his true identity was revealed in 1985. The first 4 novels were published together as the Bachman books, 4 early novels by Stephen King. The sales numbers for the Bachman novels obviously multiplied once people knew who it actually was, and now they're printed with Stephen King's name on them, Stephen King writing as Richard Bachman. He did use the pen name again years later for The Regulators and Blaze, and meta references continue to pop up right across the King bibliography. But let's return to the beginning, the very first Bachman book, 1977's Rage. Richard Bachman turned out to be much more than just a publishing loophole for Stephen King. He actually embraced the idea that this character was a different side of his creative brain. If you look at the vast majority of King's work, it's horror or thriller with a supernatural twist. Interdimensional evil, incomprehensible powers, vampires, monsters, time travel, all centered around his Dark Tower multiverse. But the first 4 Bachman novels are somehow even darker. They tap into very raw, very real, human and societal blind spots. The Long Walk is a torturous, brutal allegory of the Vietnam War, I think, killing young men who thought they were signing up for something glorious. Roadwork is the story of one man's grief and loss manifesting as violence and destruction. And The Running Man is a dystopian future shock where the collective disgrace that civilization has become is played out on TV as entertainment. But Rage is the most shocking and uncomfortable of the Bachman books due to its realism, the age of the protagonist, and now its prophetic subject matter. The plot. High school student Charlie Decker hits his chemistry teacher in the head with a great big spanner, almost killing him. A couple of days later, he's summoned from his algebra class to the principal's office, where he shows no remorse, pretty much gives the finger, and is then expelled. He storms out, takes a gun from his locker, sets the locker on fire, and then calmly returns to his algebra class. Charlie then fatally shoots his teacher, takes the 30-odd students hostage, and then kills another teacher when he tries to enter the classroom to investigate. The meat of the story is the flashbacks to Charlie's childhood, the attempted negotiations between Charlie and the figures of authority on the outside, and the tense pseudo-therapy session that transpires in the classroom. This isn't really a book review as such, but I think it's important to point out that Rage is not just a gratuitous buckets of blood horror that relies on shock value. It's very much a character study. Death and violence is vivid and abhorrent in the book, but Bachman doesn't send Charlie off on a murderous rampage. Instead, the horror comes from the apparent sympathy towards Charlie and the source of his rage. So the actual book itself was available as a standalone novel for over a decade, and from 1985 as part of the Bachman books, without any major controversy. The 70s and 80s is a booming period for all flavours of horror across literature and cinema. Rage wasn't really a hot potato, it was just another book. Uncomfortable for some, sure, but it was never hunted down by the censorship police. But then, tragedy, unwanted attention. May I interrupt this fascinatingly disturbing video for a second, please? These projects take a lot of time and effort to put together. For this one in particular, I had to travel over 3 hours to film at Charlie's house in Swindon. Surely anyone that goes to Swindon should be compensated. If you've ever been, you know exactly what I mean. You can support the channel by using Buy Me a Coffee. That's an online tipping service. You can get yourself a t-shirt or a mug at the merch store, or you can literally join a cult and sign up to our Patreon, which has various perks and bragging rights. Links to all that in the description. Thank you. Now back to the story, the history, and the fallout of Stephen King's Rage. April 1988, San Gabriel High School in California. A student named Jeffrey Lynn Cox held about 60 of his classmates hostage, armed with a semi-automatic rifle. Shots were fired, but Jeffrey was tackled to the ground, and miraculously, nobody was hurt or killed. It's alleged that he was inspired by the hijacking of Kuwait Airlines 422, which came to a head just the week before, and Rage, which apparently he read over and over again. September 1989, Jackson County High School in Kentucky. Justin L. Pierce takes a classroom of kids hostage with a shotgun and a couple of handguns. Again, nobody is hurt. A well-used copy of Rage is found in his bedroom. Once more, another terrifying incident. Fortunately, once more, nobody is killed. In September 1991, at Stevens High School, Rapid City, South Dakota. Ryan R. Harris pulls out a sawn-off shotgun in his maths class and holds the room captive for a few hours. He was overpowered by a student long enough for the cops to swoop in, and this time there is no doubt. He states that he was directly inspired by Rage. You all know what's coming, don't you? It's January 18th, 1993. East Carter High School in Grayson, Kentucky. 17-year-old Gary Pennington calmly walked into his English class and shot his teacher, Deanna McDavid, in the head with his father's gun. He also killed the school's maintenance worker, Marvin Hicks, as he entered the classroom, and then held the class hostage before eventually giving himself up. All very similar to the plot of Rage. Also, Pennington, like Rage's protagonist Charlie Decker, was a sharp kid, a good student. But he developed a grudge against Miss McDavid after she gave him a C grade for a midterm paper, an essay littered with references to death and violence. An essay about a Richard Bachman book called Rage. But unfortunately, there's more. February 1996, Frontier Middle School in Moses Lake, Washington. 14-year-old Barry Lukatis opens fire with a rifle in his algebra class, killing 2 students. He then turns to his teacher and kills her with a shot to the chest. He also holds the class hostage, but is overpowered before he can do any more harm. During the assault, he uttered the words, "This sure beats algebra." Not a direct quote from Rage, but pretty close. And years later, Stephen King would write that he believed the quote was derived from Rage. And finally, although not finally at all, this is just the start of an epidemic of school shootings which hasn't abated to this day. December 1997, Heath High School in West Paducah, Kentucky. Michael Carneal rode his bike to school with his sister, a shotgun and a rifle wrapped in a blanket, a .22 pistol in his backpack. He puts in some earplugs, pulls out a pistol, and fires into a group of students at a prayer meeting, injuring 5 and killing 3 girls. Then he puts the gun on the ground and surrenders to the principal, saying, "Kill me, please. I can't believe I did that." A copy of the Bachman books, including Rage, of course, was found in his locker. To clarify what happened next, Rage was never banned, there were no legal obligations, there was no real public outcry. Nor was there that macabre support that cases like this sometimes provoke. Stephen King's comments and opinions on the shootings and their connection to Rage have differed over time, and understandably so, and sort of in accordance with the severity of the cases. After the 1989 incident, that's the second one without any casualties, King said, yes, the kid was acting out the situation in Rage, but you can't just blame a book for those actions. And I quote King, "If they didn't do it one way, they would do it another way. Crazy is crazy." But after that last shooting in 1997, and if we're keeping count, which I think we should, we're up to 8 deaths now, Stephen King requested that the publisher remove the book from print. This didn't mean that they would recall all existing copies. Remember, this isn't a ban. It meant that the standalone novel would not be reprinted. However, in America, Rage was still available as part of the Bachman books for a few years, and for even longer in other countries, including the UK. As of the early 2000s, Rage was fully out of print everywhere, and I don't think there was ever an official audiobook. I think the plan worked. If indeed the plan was to remove the book from the zeitgeist, it became a curiosity, the subject of future essays and YouTube videos. You can still buy those vintage copies on eBay, the original novel and the Bachman books, and some people have recorded themselves reading it on YouTube, but that's vastly different from printing and promoting it. So ends the chapter on the history of the birth, the life, and the death of Rage. But it's not that simple, is it? Every corner of this story, King's fictional tale and the real-world fallout, provokes a debate. King was stuck between a rock and a hard place, but I think he was right to say, and I'm paraphrasing here, blaming a book for a school shooting is like throwing a blanket over the truth. But he also had to live with the fact that Rage was, regardless of how tenuous, a link between fiction and murder. At the time, I think he'd done the right thing by taking the book out of print. Whether that would work today with social media is another matter. It would probably have the reverse effect. And what about censorship? Remember, Rage was never banned, but opinions on what can and should be allowed to exist, even in fiction, will always divide a society. Of course, removing Rage from the eyes of potential crazy kids did not stop the shootings. And as King said back in the day, if they didn't do it one way, they would do it another way. After the Sandy Hook massacre in 2012, where 26 people were killed, most of them small children, King reacted with his essay, Guns. Rage wasn't connected to Sandy Hook, but in the essay, he talks about how his book spoke to the shooters because they were already broken. He eloquently discusses the wider issues regarding gun ownership and possible solutions to the ever-growing problem. And what of the book itself? I thought that I should actually read it so that I could have an informed opinion before making the video and not appear to be a complete hack. As a work of fiction, from a non-emotional book review perspective, considering pacing, characters, pure storytelling, I thought it was great. I also appreciated the fact that King was tackling the bigger picture, how a seemingly normal kid can turn into a cool, calm killer. Rage is not celebrating or glorifying violence and death, but it is willing to have a conversation about how the darkest corners of society manifest as tragedy. Do we need books like Rage? Is it irresponsible to open that wound and talk about a book that the author himself distanced himself from? We did consider scrapping this video completely because if the message is fumbled, then we're on the wrong side of taste and sensibility. However, we also believe that it's vital for authors to use the fictional world as a safe space to discuss harsh realities. Gratuitous horror makes you jump and squirm, but intelligent commentary wrapped in dark fiction makes you think.